Laura, Friday? Yeah, no, we're going to say this is basically it. Yeah. Yeah.
here, and here, and there's an emergency exit at the back, and the proceedings are being filmed, and it's being live streamed. Please switch off your mobile phones, and it's better not to take photographs during the presentations. Afterwards will be okay. My name is Peter Murray, and I'm going to call the speakers to come onto the stage so that we can get the proceedings going, because you've been prompt. It's 6 o'clock, and so should we. Bob Geldof, Catherine Cruin, Dorothy Cross, and Mick Foley. Present yourself. They'll be coming. Now, I want to start formally by welcoming the Mayor of County Cork, Patrick Murphy, and Councillor Mary Hegarty, and also Councillor Joe Carroll, who have very kindly come this evening, and we're very honoured to have you here. Mayor Murphy, thank you very much for coming. And we have a packed house, and we have, as I said, 4 speakers. Niamh O'Sullivan is the curator of the exhibition at the Ellen Arts Centre, and I'm going to say nothing more but give Niamh the podium so that she can get the ball rolling. Thank you.
Good evening, and a very big welcome to you all, colleagues and friends, the Mayor, and all people of Ellen. So, my name is Niamh O'Sullivan. I'm the curator of the exhibition Coming Home, Art and Great Hunger, and the curator of Ireland's Great Hunger Museum at Quinnipiac University, from where this exhibition comes. So from a spectacularly sunny launch in mid-July to a spectacularly wet end in October, I want to thank you all for coming and for your extraordinarily generous support of the exhibition. Now, the theme of the symposium this evening is, as you see, representing the unrepresentable. Much is made of the unrepresentability of the famine, but in 1847, the one artist who came to Skibbereen to look at what happened and to represent, or to try to represent what he saw, wrote in the Illustrated London News, "I can, with perfect confidence, say that neither pen nor pencil ever could portray the misery and horror to be witnessed in Skibbereen. There is nothing but devastation. The ruthless destroyer has left the walls of the houses standing, while he has unroofed them and taken away all the shelter from the people. They look like the tombs of the departed race, rather than the recent abodes of a yet living people. Turned out of their homes, the people are forced to burrow in holes and share, till they are discovered, the ditches and the bogs with otters and snipes." Yet, when we consider the work of artists today, Hughie O'Donoghue, Brian Ward, Dorothy Cross, Bill Crozier and others, we realise that, albeit 170 years later, the famine has indeed been represented. And with Coming Home, Art and the Great Hunger, we can say that the Great Silence, if such there ever was, is no more. But while we may have come to terms with our own famine, famine continues elsewhere in the world, and for this reason, if no other, this exhibition is important. Our speakers will be introduced by Peter Murray, the distinguished, recently retired director of the Crawford Art Gallery in Cork, and will consider aspects of the hunger from the 1840s to the present, from the outside in and the inside out. Now, when I spoke at the launch in July, I threw down the gauntlet to Skibbereen. We had had 60,000 visitors in Dublin. We have had over 30,000 in Skibbereen. So proportionate to population, you can say that the exhibition in Dublin has been 100 times more successful than it was in Dublin. And for that, I want to thank everybody at Cyril Thornton, the chairman of the board, Alan Davern, the director, Stephen Canty, Operations Manager, and the previous chair, Declan Tiernan, who had started this idea with us. So I want to thank all of those and the staff of Ullin, all their colleagues, who for an extraordinary job in looking after the collection and bringing it to you. And finally, I want to thank our speakers, Mick Foley, Catherine Cruan and Dorothy Cross, you all know from their work in and around Cork. Bob Gallup is new to the area, and I particularly want to thank him for his generosity in coming. Himself and his wife, Jan, are here with us this evening, and it's a very great honour. So thank you to all of you, and I hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niamh. I just have one or two little acknowledgements to make, and the first is in terms of Skibbereen telling the story of the famine. This book, written by Terry Conley of the Heritage Centre, you can read it from cover to cover in less than an afternoon, and it's very, very gripping account. Tyke Foley is here this evening. He contributed to the magnificent folio series put together by Quinnipiac University and Niamh O'Sullivan. Catherine Marshall contributed also, and Niamh O'Sullivan herself has contributed to one of those folio books. Michael Foley, who's here, another author. Luke Gibbons, also in the audience, another author. This exhibition at the Skibbereen Ullin Centre is not just an exhibition, it's an entire academic and historical research project that has involved so many writers. Those folios that I've shown you are a fraction of the total number of folios which are here on the table, and which are a testament to the academic rigour, the research, and the writing and the quality of writing in an area that for so long has really been overlooked in Irish history, but also particularly in art history. And the exhibition you will all have seen, so there's no need to go into that. But to say that the paintings by the sculpture by Dorothy Cross, who is here, and William Crozier, and Michael Farrell, Alana O'Kelly's piece too, and those of you who attended Alana O'Kelly's performance in the Skull Workhouse not so long ago will have found that to be an incredibly memorable experience. So, number one, Mick Foley, Professor Emeritus at the School of Media, DIT, a press historian, former journalist with the Irish Times, the author, and as I've said, one of the award-winning folio series, and the title of his book is Death in Every Paragraph, Journalism and the Great Irish Famine. Catherine Cruan, who is the second speaker, is a former Dean of Arts from the University of Southampton, but she's not at all a distant relation. She has a home in West Cork and has been a very, very constant presence and a great contributor to the arts in Ireland over the past 3 decades. She was married to William Crozier, apart entirely from her own professional work. She was married to the artist William Crozier and will be speaking about his work tonight. She edited a major work on William Crozier along with other monographs on Irish artists over the years, and we're delighted to have you this evening. Equally, Dorothy Cross, who has travelled from Connemara, and Dorothy is a major contemporary artist in Ireland. And in Connemara, her greatest love is to take a whale that has perhaps been tragically washed on shore and reconstruct the skeleton of the whale and make a contemporary sculpture from marine life, also from other found objects, currachs and so on. She collaborated with Fiona Shaw on the English National Opera's staging of Riders to the Sea. And currachs were employed in that. So Dorothy Cross, though, is an artist who works with video installation. She worked with contemporary materials, and her work is characterized by this extraordinary sense of no boundaries. So there's these collisions of materials, collisions of ideas in her work. She represented Ireland at the 1995 Venice Biennale. She was awarded a doctorate by UCC in 2009. And I recommend her work to you, and you will have seen it in the exhibition. That was the frame of a covered in sharkskin and speaking in the most extraordinary visual way about truths about humanity that are somehow uncomfortable and edgy, and that's a characteristic of her work. The fourth fourth speaker is Bob Geldof, first and foremost a musician and singer, most famously as the lead singer of the Boomtown Rats, a band founded in the mid-1970s, which is part of our culture today. Nobody forgets those songs. Mary Haggerty immediately began to sing I Don't Like Mondays when I mentioned this evening's event to her. And so these songs have entered our consciousness. But after seeing a BBC report of famine in Ethiopia by the reporter Michael Burke in 1984, he became involved in famine and death relief and has used his talents, and also his status as a musician in order to garner the most extraordinary success in terms of galvanizing people to help with famine, particularly in Africa, under the banner of Live Aid. He's been an anti-poverty activist ever since, and he co-wrote the most successful Christmas song ever, Do They Know It's Christmas? So each speaker this evening has sadly only 15 minutes to try and encapsulate, I suppose, some of the ideas and some of the themes relating to the exhibition. And one would have an hour of each of them. It would be fascinating. My invidious job is to hold them to 15 minutes, and I hope that they will comply. I have put a little clock here, just a reminder. It's quite simple. You may do it as you prefer, at the table or standing. It's entirely your preference. There. Just a housekeeping note. Questions are best kept to the very end, I think, after all four speakers have been allowed to have their say. Thank you.
The consensus was we would do it here. Yeah, this is a huge honor for me to be here. I have had a close relationship with this collection and through my wife, Neil, and I was actually at not only the opening of this exhibition, but I was actually at the opening of the museum in Quinnipiac. So to be here at the last day of the exhibition in Skibbereen is quite emotional, actually, in ways. As being said, I wrote a piece on the famine in West Cork for the Folio series. And the reason was, I suppose when I was at university, I studied history, and the famine was part of it. So when Neve started working on this, the collection and the museum in the States, I started looking at the famine again. And I'd been writing about the press, and so I decided to try and look at the press and the famine. Now, I didn't want to sort of just say, what was covered, how did they cover the famine? I wanted to look and say, how did the press develop? How did they handle it? What was it like to be a journalist in the 1840s? So what I'm going to talk to you tonight is just a few thoughts on, I suppose, how did journalists represent the unrepresentable? The famine posed huge problems for the press in Ireland. The journalist's skill set was a rather limited one, limited to reporting often at length the speeches and comments of men in authority, MPs, local authority members, judges, coroners. But remember, at this stage, journalists actually didn't know how to do it. It's odd for us to realise it. But Dickens, for instance, who was a journalist, wrote Oliver Twist in 1838, and he had to fictionalise his account of the poor of London, which today would be done by an investigative journalist or something. So it wasn't unusual that Irish journalists wouldn't know how to do this. It just wasn't part of what journalists knew how to do or what they were doing. So the 1840s, notwithstanding the famine, was a period of change in Ireland and much of Europe. The cultural historian Jo Leersen calls it a saddle period. Well, actually, he uses quite a long German word, but it's a saddle period. And when people look both backwards and forwards, and philosophically, the idea of a common humanity was becoming an increasingly popular concept since the Enlightenment, culminating in the French Revolution, the formulation of the rights of man, and philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, who maintained that human beings were owed respect because of their humanity and they were capable of reason. The other side of that mountain, col or saddle was the providentialism of much of the British establishment, the view that famine was God's will, a divine response to sloth, laziness and Catholicism. And this was coupled with Malthusian political economy and a view that famine was inevitable and had the added benefit of teaching virtuous behaviour. Within this sort of new capitalist economies, the peasant were becoming workers, but they were still considered a collective. But they were also becoming individual consumers. And the more progressive publications were constantly trying to find new ways of reflecting the individual in their stories. Benedict Anderson says it was print capitalism which made it possible for rapidly growing numbers of people to think about themselves and relate themselves to others in profoundly new ways. James Vernon, in a wonderful history of hunger, says the hungry became figures of humanitarian concern only when novel forms of news reporting connecting people emotionally with the suffering of the hungry and refuted the Malthusian model of causation. In this sense, hunger first becomes news in the 1840s. So what were these new ways of reporting? Well, if the reporters themselves weren't sure how you would actually tell the story of poverty, the newspaper editors looked to other people to do it for them. And here in West Cork, there was Dr. Robert Traill, who was the director and vicar of Skull, who wrote in the Cork Constitution very profoundly emotional pieces. He died of famine fever himself. Dr. Daniel Donovan wrote in the Southern Reporter, and he was a medical officer of the Skibbereen Dispensary and Union Workhouse, and actually probably the most well-known writer coming out of the famine, at least journalistically. He wrote Diary of a Dispensary Doctor, which I always think the alliteration is sort of nicely tabloid in a way. And the Cork Examiner had its regular contributors from West Cork, Jeremiah O'Callaghan. So these people, in effect, took over the role which today would be covered by journalists, and they did it because the journalists didn't really know if that was their job. What the journalists did do, and the papers are all full of them, is cover inquests. And the inquests showed that when people who died and how they died and the appalling conditions in which they died in showed that the poor were actually innocent. But there is one story which I want to talk about. Is it up there? A slide of the Bridget O'Donnell, which I thought was going to be up there, but it's not. Do I have a clicker? Is it? Oh, there it is. Thank you. Yeah. No, it's just the one. I don't got the one. Anyway, this is Bridget O'Donnell and her children. It appears in the Illustrated London News, and it's amazingly important for a number of reasons. In many ways, she symbolizes the way the famine changes journalism. It is an image of a famine victim from County Clare, as I say, Bridget O'Donnell and her children, which appears in 1849 in the Illustrated London News. It's well known to anyone with the slightest interest in great famine or Irish history. It is, to use a rather cliche word, iconic. She is familiar to us from book covers and pamphlets, and she's the starting point of many contemporary images commemorating the famine. Artists such as Rowan Gillespie and John Behan have incorporated her image into their sculptural pieces, which are in the exhibition, which you of course can't see anymore because it's closed. She holds a place in press history for two reasons. First, we know who she is, and that is incredibly unusual. Newspapers and periodicals did not deal in human interest. They did not tell us about the poor except in the most general terms. And the only way people like Bridget O'Donnell would have been named in a paper of the day was if she appeared in court or before some sort of public hearing or tribunal. The poor were mentioned anonymously, of course, or part of a mob or peasantry, but they were seldom identified by name. The second reason is that the words that actually appear on the other page, which is a first-person interview, where she said about she and her husband had 4 acres of land, half of it was bog, about how she had given birth to a baby who died at birth, about her 13-year-old son had died, and about the fact that she was probably going to die herself. And it is a story narrated by a destitute woman, cheated of her home and possessions, and devastated by the death of her 13-year-old son. And she's shown the knowledge of her own not too distant death as well. The article attempts to engage the reader emotionally and convey the scale and depth and gravity of the situation directly from the mouth of the victim to the reader of the paper, and this by means of an interview. Now, for those of us who've got a sort of rather nerdy interest in press history, this is amazing, because the first interview is meant to be in 1859, when Horace Greeley interviewed Brigham Young for the New York Tribune. On this side of the Atlantic, interviews don't appear until the 1880s and 90s, and then the Times had a wonderful policy that you could never interview anyone in England. You could only interview foreigners, because the interview was seen as a rather low form of journalism. And there was, I think it's Dickens actually, what novel, he laughs in his book at the American journalists who go off and interview people. It's considered slightly unethical. But here, in 1849, is an interview with a woman appearing, it appears in the Illustrated London News, an incredibly respectable middle-class publication. When it started, the publishers sent free copies to every vicar in Britain on the basis it was seen on the coffee tables, if they had coffee tables, of vicars, then everyone would know it was a respectable journal. So it was a conservative publication, and here was an interview. So, the interesting is why this occurs. Of course, the interview isn't an interview in the sense that the later ones become. The only reason it's there, in a way, is because the artist who illustrated, who drew the picture, wanted to show it was true. Because, of course, the reason James Manley was in Ireland doing these illustrations, because no one could actually believe that the newspapers that they read in London from Ireland, they could actually be true. Could this really be happening in the world's largest, most progressive empire, as they say? And of course, Ireland, because of the Act of Union, was an integral part of the United Kingdom. So in the first half of the 19th century, there was tension within the British government and governing elite between protectionism and free trade, between traditional landlord class and the interests of the new capitalist class. The famine occurs during the height of this debate, and journalists, amongst others, seek ways to include the hungry in its coverage. As Vernon notes, in the wake of the new Poor Law, the Irish famine, journalists and social innovators developed new techniques to represent the innocent suffering of the hungry by giving it a human face, and they ensure that hunger, both home and abroad, becomes a focal point of humanitarian concern. So that's why Bridget O'Donnell appeared, and that's why her interview goes. Terry Eagleton, talking of the famine, says because of the famine, Irish society undergoes a surreal speed up of its entry upon modernity. But what spurs that process on, contradictorily, is a thoroughly traditional calamity. Part of the horror of the famine is its atavistic nature, the mind-shaking fact that an event with all the pre-modern character of a medieval pestilence happened in Ireland with frightening recentness. And when we look at the coverage of the famine, and we look especially the ones I looked at in the three newspapers here in Cork, you begin to understand where what we might call the grammar of disaster coverage comes from. The notion of pack journalism, the idea of everyone coming to Cork, as they did, was because three newspapers were telling them what was happening, so editors in London knew they were going to get a story. The other thing that happens is the portrayal of women and children. Susan Muller, an American writing about contemporary famine, although she could have been writing about the Irish famine, says, starving children are the famine icon. An emaciated child is not yet associated with the stereotypes attached to his colour, its culture, or its political environment. Skeletal children personify innocence abused. That brings moral clarity to the complex story of a famine. Their images cut through the social, economic, and political context to create an imperative statement, a hierarchy of innocence. And this is the first time that's done. This is the first time that children and a mother are used to tell the complex story of a family in a newspaper and in the media. And it's because they can't find how else do you tell that complex story when you use innocence. And you don't then have to actually deal with political fallout. You just showed that innocence, and that's why it occurred. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mick. And Catherine Crowell, please. I was reminded as Mick was talking about Fraser's magazine, which I would recommend to anybody to read, from the 19th century, from that era, and it was founded in London by Cork journalists and contains fascinating material, including illustrations by Daniel Macleese. That whole story is an amazing one. And Skibbereen is so famous with in terms of famine studies, largely because of the quality of writing and the quality of narrative that came from West Cork. So with that thought, Catherine Gruen, please.
Good evening. Rainbow's End. I need to put it on the screen. Right. It's a bit of a blurry image, but I hope you can see it. It's not about the famine, but I can tell you it fixes on exactly the same themes. The forgotten corpse, the anonymous, meaningless death, the isolation of dying, issues that you see in so many of that fine collection from Quinnipiac. Bill would have thought it was an honour to be part of that collection, just as I find it an honour to be here this evening speaking on his behalf. But my purpose in this little presentation isn't to generalise about art or the famine. I'd be very ill-equipped to do either, you'll be relieved to hear. But I want to show you how he approached the depiction of pretty well the darkest aspects of the human condition, and how he used landscape, which very frequently in the history of art is regarded as an intrinsically conservative genre, as a vehicle to be subverted, even to be slightly radical. But let's start with Rainbow's End. It was painted in, we think, 1970 in London. The artist was 40. He was in mid-career. His background is well known. He was born and raised on the west coast of Scotland into a family that considered itself as Irish as it was Scottish, his parental family coming from Northern Ireland, from County Antrim. Bill grew up in a sectarian working-class society. He was educated at Glasgow School of Art, and the minute he graduated, he left for Paris. He lived in Dublin in the 50s, lived for a period in Spain in the 60s, but it's fair to say that he made his reputation in London. By the age of 30, he was considered one of the young Turks, one of the young British artists of the time. Great critical acclaim followed, lots of sales, one of the most exciting young artists in London. But by the age of 40, things were definitely more complicated. Now, if you try to pick out what was the key element of Bill's growing up, which seemed to affect the rest of his life, and which has a bearing on this evening's subject, it is being at the age of 15, sitting in the local cinema in Troon in Ayrshire, and seeing the newsreel of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Allied troops. Bill was aware at the time, and ever afterwards it seemed, of the enormity of what he was seeing. And at the time he said he felt ashamed because he was unable to deal emotionally or intellectually with the horror of it. And the Holocaust led him to search for a philosophy or some form of moral code that would enable him to deal with the senselessness of it all, the banality of evil, as Aaron called it. And he found it in existentialism, as many people did at that time. What did he mean by that? It meant that you jumped any form of belief system, because the only defining characteristic of being human was the freedom to act, and on that you should be judged. Throughout his life, Bill's only article of faith was Jean-Paul Sartre's dictum, "You are the sum total of your actions." But the flip side of freedom is the tremendous responsibility it carries, which can produce its own terrors. With Sartre, Bill believed that it was the place of the artist to be engagé, that is, to be socially active and politically aware. That's not to be a political artist. Bill would have shuddered at the description. To be engagé is to be informed and involved. But what are the sources for the imagery in Rainbow's End? Well, there are many. Photographs and films of the First World War and the Second World War. Lots of studies made from a medical school skeleton, and colour as ever in the Crozier, which becomes ratcheted up to create a sort of an emotional intensity, almost a toxicity. Because if you think of heat and if you think of a decomposing body, you think of the whole process being accelerated, the body becoming part of the earth. And in Rainbow's End, if you look at that painting, that skeletal figure and the landscape inhabit the same space. They're indivisible. And it was entirely intentional on Bill's part. He said he wanted to create a landscape as a state of mind, in the sense that someone who's in a state of stress or in a state of isolation sees the world as a projection of themselves. And I think it's also very telling that the year before Rainbow's End was painted, Bill visited the site of the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen. And it was at least 7 years after that that he's quoted in an interview saying, "The enormity of that horror I've still not fully dealt with." But think back to 1970, when the picture was painted. Bill didn't have to think back to World War II to be reminded of the atrocities of man's inhumanity. In 1970, he just had to look towards Northern Ireland. And here was a problem. Emotionally and spiritually, he thought of himself as Irish, but in actual fact, he was a British subject. This was a dilemma, and it created a profound psychological tension, which he only resolved by giving up his British passport and adopting Irish citizenship, which he did in 1973, and remained living in England. It was an act of deep conviction on his part, but I can tell you, it was regarded as at best romantic bravado by his friends, regarded as an outrage by his family, and with some distaste by some elements of the English art establishment. It's one thing to adopt Irish citizenship in 2018 because of Brexit, and quite another to do so in the circumstances of the Troubles in the 1970s. Now, I'm uncertain of the professional consequences that came from that, and I'm wary of establishing cause and effect. But I can tell you that Bill was never invited to show the skeleton paintings in any public or commercial venue in London or Edinburgh, though they were shown to great acclaim in Glasgow and Liverpool, the latter where they were hung in the Walker Art Gallery alongside work by Francis Bacon. But what strikes me, who met Bill shortly after this, was that his view of Ireland, based though it was on deep knowledge, love, reason, reading, was essentially the view from the diaspora, with all the romanticism that that implies. It's very different when you live here. And that, I think, is one great difference between Bill's work such as Rainbow's End and the landscape paintings that he created after 1984 in West Cork. We bought a house here in 1983. Although the figures disappeared from Crozier landscapes, he said, I like my landscape subjects to have the feeling that man is just temporarily absent from the scene. And he used to get exasperated when people would say in all good faith, Bill, you should go to New England to look at the fall. You'd find the colour wonderful, and he'd say, why? It means nothing to me. But we're better than in West Cork, where every field carries a story, to marry history with the visual. What we didn't know when we bought a house here, maybe we should have done, but the townland of Kilcoe and its surroundings witnessed some of the most abject, harrowing episodes of the famine and the years afterwards, and they're all documented by the parish priest. So how can the artist reconcile the historical landscape with empirical observed experience? How can he reconcile the history, the landscape as a repository for history, with its exhilaration, visionary enjoyment of it? Well, the painting on the screen is called At the Crooked Bridge, and I think it's a good example of what he did. The other thing which occurred to us, and we could only gather this by living here, is that in the 1980s, Ireland itself was undergoing massive change. There was economic downturn, but at a local level here, the landscape itself was something dynamic. It wasn't static. It was being tempered by changing patterns of labour, ownership, just changed agricultural practice. And Bill wanted to understand all of it. He said, if I can't understand the economics of my neighbours, how can I paint their land with any conviction? And he loved listening to and quizzing his neighbours about the land. Why was that field being reclaimed? Why was the new grass a sharper colour? What was the price of a cow? There was even a brief period when he read the Irish Farmers Weekly and found it impenetrable. The painting on the screen is At the Crooked Bridge. Its subject is a piece of ground between Kilcoe and Ballydehob, and these days it's on the N71. But it was also, in the 1880s, the site of a murder of the landlord, Robert Kingston, by two local men. And it was a place that we often used to walk out and look out and visit, for no reason other than Bill liked the shape of the rock. But then he read in the Illustrated London News the history of this area. And he describes visiting it by himself after then. He said, the landscape seemed to set the emotional key of the scene. The landscape seemed to set the emotional key for the crime, if crime it was. And I knew I could make a painting which evoked a sense of tragedy, simply in the depiction of a familiar rough field. So that history and the visual come together. I can barely see this, so apologies. But in 1995, the George Moore Society invited him to create a painting on the theme of the family for the big exhibition they were curating to commemorate 150 years since 1845. And Bill submitted this painting, which is called Atlantic Island. It was based on the inspiration which came from Roaring Water Bay. And there are several island pictures around this time. But in this one, painted for the exhibition, the island in Roaring Water Bay has been simplified to become simply an icon of an island. All topographical reference has been abandoned in order to create this image of isolation and exile. It doesn't conjure up the literal horrors of Rainbow's End. It takes a much more stoical approach to tragedy. I'll end by saying how Bill Crozier described himself. He said, for convenience, I call myself a landscape painter. Landscape, though, is just the vehicle through which I can express intangible things. Exile, longing, loss. I think the landscape, as much as the history of West Cork, allows you to do just that. Thank you very much.
landscape better than any artist I know. He really loved the way the rocks came up through the land, exposing the harsh, rugged nature of the landscape. We have many farmers in this area who are intent on removing all of those and levelling fields and increasing productivity. It's incredible to see it today. It's almost like a testament or a memory of the famine today that drives ever more efficient farming practice in this area. It's an eloquent testament to the tradition of farming in this whole area of West Cork. So, but Bill captured a certain moment with it. So thank you for that presentation. Dorothy Cross is going to talk now about her own work, and her work is in the exhibition. And as I mentioned, Dorothy is one of our leading contemporary artists. You know, the speakers tonight are addressing the impossible, because the whole theme of this seminar is how to represent the unrepresentable. And so Dorothy will address that.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. It's very good to be here, coming from Cork and coming home. And I want to thank Neil O'Sullivan, actually, for kind of finding my work and placing it in relationship to famine. The way I work is never certain, and I adored this kind of lure of the impossibility of representation. And when she was on the phone to me, this sounds terribly academic, but I'm not academic, she used the word apophatic, and I thought, I wonder what that means. But she then spoke about the impossibility of representation, and as a visual artist, I realized for 62 years, you know, I've been trying to represent the impossible, and it's all about that. But the word apophatic is so exciting. It comes from the Greek. Apo means off or away from, and phani means to speak. And it refers to transcendence and unknowability. And it's used in terms of religion, as apophatic religion, of knowledge of God obtained through negating concepts that apply to God, to speak only in terms of what may not be said. And as a visual artist who shies away from words, that is terribly, terribly exciting. And I find the visual extraordinarily powerful, but also always falls short. It's frustrating the way it always falls short. And I've spoken before about the impossibility of a great work of art, and now we live in a society where there's, you know, a market that's obscene when it comes to prices of art, and that makes it even more difficult to be an artist because you're caught up in this awful kind of business. But to get to the pieces, and I'm just going to refer to 5 pieces of work. This is the Banksy Sharp Kirk that you might have seen up in the exhibition upstairs. And I have a fondness for these things, and when I meet them again, they kind of remind me of how it was that I made them. And there's always stories behind these things. But I found the Banksy Sharp on a beach in Wexford, thanks to the Irish Glen and Dolphin Group, and I had found a little curragh that Peter referred to from a place called Mehalmara on the Lee, where they train young people to make boats. It's a fantastic fall scheme. And they both came together. The scale of the shark, in some sense, fitted the scale of the curragh. And the beautiful accident of the fin of the basking shark functioning almost like a keel. And why this might fit into something to do with famine is because it's about this collision between safety from drowning, perhaps, in the ocean, this little vessel that might save your life, that is skinned with an animal that we fear desperately and abhor, even though the basking shark is a toothless animal that you know, swims and filter feeds for plankton. There is this primal fear that people have in relationship to shark. I've always been very, very attracted to shark because so little is known about them and about their age and the fact that they were one of the first animals living on this planet. And now they're under massive threat by finning, especially by the Chinese market. When they actually cut the fins off the animals and throw them back into the sea and they drown, it's just unbelievably awful. So the little basking shark curragh, when Niamh came to my studio, we spoke about that in terms of safety and fear, and those two relationships that come together. And also the way now its life will be seen in relationship to famine. And the thing about something as monstrous as famine is that as humans we find it impossible to relate to it. And I think the function of visual art is to give the human being, the body that we walk around in, a role in relationship to what they encounter, but in my case, usually some physical thing, but whether it's a painting or a video or a photograph. And it's this wonderful kind of, it feels like some kind of theatre, but in fact, I think when it's at its most powerful, the essence of it brings you back into a forced reality of what you are standing in relationship to. But with something like famine, it is almost impossible to imagine. So that kind of ties in again to this whole, the other small, little tiny job that I do in my studio every day, to try and create things that will surprise me and make me feel, actually. And the next piece, this was another shark that I made called Relic, and it was first shown in an exhibition I did in the Bloomberg Centre in London. And it was a poor beagle shark that was being sold for fish and chips, I think, in the Cork market. And a friend of mine used meat for his restaurant, and then I formed the animal so that it looked like it was still alive, and gilded the lining of his skin with gold. The skin of something, again, that most people are repulsed by or afraid of. I was trying to invert and make into something very precious. And this notion of disembodiment is something that intrigues me more and more, and it's why I could never paint a painting or make a sculpture of a person, because it's about absence, and it's about loss, and it's about our own potential loss, and the brevity of our existence on this planet, which in some sense we should be able to dive into the massive scenario that goes on in the world in relationship to our own frailty and vulnerability. But there's something, maybe it's genetic, that protects us from accessing that horror. And for the shark, because we project such fear onto this animal, I love it even more, because they're so misunderstood and they're blamed for our own fear. And I dive a lot, and when you encounter a shark underwater, they're not interested in you the majority of the time. Most shark attacks are misidentification. So there's something very, very beautiful about this animal. And when you see it in real life, you have this mixture of the abomination of the skinning, which is brutal, but the animals were dead when I found them and weren't killed for the use, for my own use. But then the attempt is to try and beautify. It's always to try and beautify and bring something back to a kind of a gentle acceptance of this territory of uncertainty. Which leads to a piece called Pearl Bone. I was asked to do a project in the Bloomberg Centre in London. And what's lovely sometimes, a bit like making a piece, or having the piece that Niamh saw in my studio now go into the scenario of famine and have a different context or a different endorsement. You go to Bloomberg, they're all working in their offices and they're telling you the value of the yen or the dollar, and you see all these glass little boxes with people at their computers. So I can't just put a piece of work in there that is out of context. So I decided I would, in the 15th century, the trouble with me is I tell stories. I know I've only got 15 minutes, but the stories are what it's about. They're so exciting for me in my life, it's very exciting. So my brother is a scientist who might be here tonight. I asked him, does he know any scientist who's dealing with pearls? Because in the 15th century, the pearl was the most valuable item on the planet, and it was used as currency. So I decided I would try and bring human bones to a pearl farm and see if the animal would cover the bones with nacre, which is this beautiful material that we all love, which is the pearl. But in fact, it's manufactured by the animal when the animal is irritated by a bit of undigested food or grit in their body, and it rolls and rolls and makes the pearl. So we found a pearl farm in Tahiti, which is very nice. So I went to Tahiti for 10 days with a human hand, the fingertip bones of a human hand in my pocket. And my Aunt May, who grew up in Cork in Montenotte, was a pathologist, and her house, there were always bits of bones lying around, because in those days they used bones for educational purposes. Now they're all plastic, and obviously there's a big kind of law against using human bones. So I was sitting in the plane. I was sitting in the plane with the fingertip bones of human in my pocket, and going, "Oh my God, who is this person?" And but feeling okay about it because what I was trying to do was bring something that is part of all of us. We all have these bones, and the tips of our fingers are tiny, but we so refuse to kind of consider our own structures. Because maybe, again, about this whole thing about fear. But I did feel if I was dead and somebody found my hand and brought it to Tahiti and put it into a pearl oyster, that was my way of saying it was okay. And also, what happens in the end is it beautified? Is something that we fear, the bone, then made okay because it's covered in black pearl? And what the animals did was they regurgitated 4 of the fingertip bones, and I ended up with just 1. But what was so beautiful for an artist, for this artist-arter kind of context, is it's the index finger, which refers to Michelangelo, refers to St. Anne by Leonardo da Vinci, and it was this directive thing, which is pointing upwards, which for me, you know, if there had been 5 fingertips, they would have been like nail varnish, perhaps. So that is another piece that actually brings us, I make notes and I don't really refer to them at all, but I'm going to tell you one other quick story. At the same time as I was working on that, I was asked to make a piece for the Imperial War Museum in England. I don't know why, but sometimes you get these invitations, and it's kind of a competition. And I came up with an idea which it really confirmed for me the abhorrence people have for our own human structure and our own bones. And the idea was about the north of Ireland, and I went to the Imperial War Museum, and there's nothing there but tanks and guns, and you think, what the hell is this about? Is this promotion? Or is this something to tell us we shouldn't go to war? So the idea was to get the top of a human skull and engrave into the top the 3,700 people that died in the north of Ireland, to try and find their signatures, which would then personalise it. Engraved with indigo into the top of the head, one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other. You would end up with this beautiful blue indigo glow, and you wouldn't be able to read any of the names. So that was the idea. Rejected. Not uncommon. Most of my ideas are rejected. But which makes, I think there's some kind of weird turn, makes me feel good, and maybe if they're all accepted, I feel bad. So there are 2 other works that I will just show you that have something to do with a communal situation, which like if we were here in the mid-19th century, it would have been a communal death, a communal suffering. And that impossibility of speaking about it is the kind of circularity that you have to go around the thing because it is impossible to talk about. And I remember reading a book by Elaine Scarry called The Body in Pain. And my mother suffered from chronic pain, and I remember I was very academic, I hardly understood it. And I remember her sitting in the bed trying to read this book, and how you describe pain, whether it's psychological pain or physical pain. Again, an impossibility. So this was a piece of work I wanted to make for many years, and I didn't have the money. And then this wonderful woman in Salisbury called Madeline Vesper funded me to make it last year. And I went to Ferrara in Italy and made a model of this single bed with the impression of a head and the sheets dishevelled, almost like a little kind of hospital trolley bed, as if the person had just left. So you're not too sure whether it's about death, it's about life, it's about sleep, what's it about? And then these brilliant craftspeople in Carrara made it by hand without computer, which I really admire. And then it just sits like this little memorial. But it's about the position of us, the possibility of occupation, whether it's some kind of past, a memory of some occupation that's dead, or some future position for ourselves on this planet. And I think it was this one theatrically in some ways did give you that space, because it was so easy to imagine. This whole thing about imagination, and we're being kind of narrowed so much in education and everything these days that there's very little space to imagine. And then we're restricted, of course, by our own short time on the planet again. So I'm just going to end on this piece, and this is one of my, I love this little piece. It's a kiss. It's the cast of a kiss taken from the insides of two people's mouths. And it's made, for anyone who wants to, this alginate plaster that you know, to get the impression of your mouth. And I would invite people to dinner, put alginate in both their mouths, and then they would kiss, and you hold it for about 2 minutes. And there's pressure, when, it was very funny, there's nothing erotic about it whatsoever. So when the mouth, you can see the top of one palate meeting the top of the other palate, and where the two lips meet most intimately is where the hole is. So, because that's where the lips pressed the alginate away, and that's where the skin touched the skin. And so, in some sense, maybe all my work is about loss, but again, the inversion of loss is gain. So this is almost like a skeleton of a kiss. And again, it's I suppose, you know, proof of something that existed, but that has become this bowl. And that's the last piece I'll talk to you about. So thank you very much.
And I'd like to introduce Bob Geldof to say a few words. And Dorothy's work it speaks to the human condition, as I said. I remember particularly when you got the hides of cows and made furniture from them, but there was an interaction between the human form, the furniture, and then the hides of cattle, and also, you know, the udders and teats of cattle too. So there was this incredible sense of exploring the difference between what's animal and what's human, and the connection between them two. So the reflection upon that is so pertinent to the issue of the famine. And in the exhibition, so many of the paintings that you looked at in this last day were of rosy-cheeked, healthy-looking people. There were so few of the emaciated, the true spectres that are described by writers. Luke Gibbons, who was here this evening, sums it up very well in his folio edition, where he just talks about the way in which language and words could communicate these things, but artists had to almost draw short because the images are so sensational and they're so horrific that people cannot actually look at them. But in your work, I think you managed to work your way through the cracks and say eloquent things with visual matter. Bob Geldof, please.
Thank you very much for putting on the heating. I've known Mick for probably 55, 60 years, and obviously also Neve, his wife. And when I saw the exhibition in Dublin a couple of months ago, it was astonishingly painful. And when Mick wrote to me and said, "Will you come down and you know, for the final show in Skibbereen?" I said, "You can fuck off, it's always raining down there." And he said, "Nonsense. It's always sunshine and warm." And I said, "Okay, well in that case I'll bring my wife down because she's French and she likes a bit of heat and sun, so thanks a lot, me and Nick." Ladies and gentlemen, it's impossible to describe the actuality of famine. And unfortunately, and probably, and luckily for you, I'm the only person to have trawled many times through that existential human condition. And it doesn't bear thinking about, and it certainly can't be reproduced in painting, as Luke put in his book. And whereas poetry and song enable us to articulate the otherwise inarticulate or express the otherwise inexpressible, despite the journalist's best effort from the earliest times, as we heard Mick say, it still doesn't work. I want to pick up a few points on where Mick started, because my exposure to this happened, of course, through the media. And coming to the present, the overexposure of all of us to a constant media assault has rendered effect and sensation a nullity, to the point where when the activists and the NGOs try and make people alert to the crisis and the ridiculous prospect of more humans dying of want in a world of surplus, they are forbidden to show you the dying baby for two reasons. One, it's a cliche, and two, it's poverty porn. The words, the camera, have become prurient. The 24-hour news cycle loves this shit because you can't get enough of the Florida hurricanes, people crying and dying babies. So I'll tell you what a dying baby is. A dying baby dying of hunger can't make any sound anymore. The muscles have actually deteriorated, so the muscles don't work. The phenomenon of the Irish famine, like all famines, is that actually relatively few people died of starvation. What they died of was disease, because the immune system collapses at a certain point, and then nature is overwhelmed with even greater nature. You die. So when you see a 2-year-old, and this is specific to me, and I don't talk about this stuff, of course, because you can't. It's the same way that Bill came back from Bergen-Belsen, and I've been around a few of those places also. When you see these human beings, and you really must keep a grip on the notion that you are amongst human beings, because they don't look like that. They don't sound like it. The sound is a low moaning. It's not a keen, it's a groan, very low, barely audible, because the mouth can't do that anymore. And what you're aware of is the constant buzzing of flies. But if you pick up one of these humans and their heads seem magnified and their bodies barely exist and there is no weight, and the eyes are rigid open, you're aware, you've seen the photographs, but they actually can't close their eyes. And the flies cluster around the eyes and the mouth, because that stays open, but that's completely dry as well. And you lift up this human beside the elegant, sentient parents in as much agony as any of you would be, to watch their child die very painfully. To die of hunger is excruciatingly painful, but you can't make any noise. There's no expression, just like it can be expressed through the media. And the final thing is that this human shits its life through your fingers, voids itself, and is gone. So how? You tell me. How is that expressed in any known medium? It can't be. And so the rigours of what happened here are so inexpressible that there's some sort of intelligibility to the whole experience of what happened to this country and some of the others I've been in. This land here is full of ghosts, and they tickle away at us because we haven't quite remembered exactly. We've used the fact of the famine. The nationalists have used it. The economists have used it. The historians have used it. The politicians have used it. The fact of the event. But out of John Kelly's farm today, Green Farm, I had to break away from the group, looking at the wonderful and mad stuff that he's created with his wife and the beautiful farm, and just walk away, because there was a sense in amongst this art that he'd made and the folly that he's created of something missing. And in 1850, what was missing was the country and the past. It had gone. And in that great national absence, in that huge psychological void, we had to reinvent ourselves. An entire class of Irish people who had spoken a different language, who worshipped a completely different God to the Catholic one that would soon be enforced upon them by Bishop Cullen, where the priests would go the stations from one house to another occasionally, but the people still went to the wells, Sunday's wells in Cork, where they still worshipped around the agricultural cycle, where they still believed in the ancient gods that had once roamed here. And we no longer knew who we were. How could we? And yet the stories of the famine are so fascinating because it isn't as we're told. The farmers who had become the bourgeoisie, they were going for it. Very few of them were affected. They were quite happy to see the peasant class, the courtiers, be decimated. It's not strictly true that the landowners were indifferent. In this area alone, 4 of the great landowners went completely bankrupt because for 3 years they didn't take their rents to try and keep their peasants going. So these stories that we conjure up for our own political end tend to obviate the obvious. That this was mass carnage, which wasn't throughout the entire country, was in spicks and specks and spots wide. But talking to Mick today about 2 diaries I've read, a young Irelander on the run, moving between the cottages, he never once mentions the famine. Not once. He talks about the extreme poverty he encounters. In one cabin, 3 naked children rolling in the pig shit, where the pigs sit, but actually sitting and rolling in it. He then talks about the food he was given. Fried badger, fresh milk, fresh butter, fresh eggs, fresh potatoes. That isn't what I read. And so when the journalist came along to try and transcribe this bizarre effect that this blight and its concomitant diseases was having, they latched onto, what's her name, Bridget? They latched onto her. When the Ethiopian famine came to our attention, Michael Burke stumbled upon this great human presence in the north of Ethiopia. He was going north to cover the Civil War, the longest running war of the 20th century. And he came upon this field where 350,000 people were sitting. Doing what? They were waiting to die. Now that's odd, except what they did in Ireland was that they walled themselves into their cabins as a family and died. Why? One of the things when Band Aid was set up, and still continues daily, was one of the trustees, still one of them, would ask, why don't they eat the birds in the camps? Why don't they eat rats? And all the NGOs were horrified and scoffed at the naivety of this man. And I said, no answer, why don't they? And there wasn't an answer. But the reality is that these were human beings. And they were dignified, and they were not going to stoop to that, even should they die. And they would cut their children's hair into a little top knot so that God could reach down and grab the kid as soon as he died. This is what it is to be human. And we lose that in the expression of the reality of famine. And when we now see the child that particularly moved me that late October evening in 1984, she was exactly as I've described the innumerable ones I've seen. We did manage to get to her so that by Live 8, 20 years later, she walked out on the stage, of those of you who watched it, this beautiful Ethiopian girl of now 19, 20 or 21, who'd just done her agricultural exams in Mekelle University in northern Ethiopia. And it was as emblematic as the woman that Mick showed you. But you were incredibly fascinated by the fact that nothing had changed in media terms. Whether these newspapers had hit upon the fact that they could identify the human in the horror, and through that one image, tell you what was happening. But today, I don't think it works anymore. I think that with the ubiquity of the web, with the 24-hour news cycle, with the race to the bottom to try and find the stuff that will entertain us even momentarily, and as Mick explained, the Malthusian notion of population and economics that still prevails. Most of the world believe that there's too many, for example, Africans, that there's too many people in the world, that we're consuming this finite planet and all the resources in it. Africa is the most underpopulated continent in the planet. Europe is the size of one country in Africa. The United States fits into the Sahara Desert. China and Russia and South America drop without a ripple into the center of Africa. It's vast. Nigeria will have 750 million people by 2050. Can they sustain it? No. So what famine is the collapse of systems, the failure of being human, one to another. And that's exactly what we saw in Ireland, and it's precisely what we see in Africa. And while I think it's 1951, the height of emigration was 250,000 people. That was the height of the process. Tonight on our screens we'll see more people who've crossed a desert the size of the United States to get to that 8-mile gap between the richest continent in the world and the poorest. 8 miles. And in that tiny void is all our baleful past. And I'm telling you now, it is our coming future. Because just like we left in our hundreds of thousands and continue to do so, so too they will, to get a better life, not to be hungry, to ensure that their children are never lifted up by the top knot on their head, to make sure they never have to look at these almost Martian-type creatures, their children, void their lives through their fingers. So when we talk about the Irish famine, when we talk about the country that evolved from that, and that for me has always been the birthplace of where we are, not the nonsense of 1916, that absolute cogent human reality, where one world went and disappeared and a new one had to be invented that kept the memory of this existential national event somehow alive, not in our heads, but somewhere in some mythic part of our soul. And so when Band Aid or Live Aid happened, it was no accident that this country pro rata gave more than the rest of the world. Nepal, I think, was third, Barbados second, but this country, and of course I'm a Paddy, so that was a lot to do with it. But more to the point, there was an immediate, I think, I could be over-romanticising this, there was an immediate association of understanding, not just there by the grace of God go I, but an understanding of the horror. And the consequences of that, the consequences of our moment, resonate today. In a study of the famines of 1944 in Holland, the year of hunger they call it, followed up by another study of the famines of China in the Cultural Revolution 1966, it became clear that not only are we negotiating what we thought were imaginary ghosts, but we negotiate with actual ghosts. That DNA is affected in any 1 year of famine. Not just the DNA of the victim, but inherited from then on. And schizophrenia occurs in greater numbers amongst those affected by famine. Now we have, and have had, a serious history of mental health depressions. And a lot of people associate this back to this time beyond terror. And so the resonances continue in every sense of culture, of art, of politics, but actually in our own DNA structures. Famine is abhorrent. It is anti-life. It is anti what it is to be human. On that first day, when I stayed up with Midge, mixing the Band Aid record, I took it at about 6 in the morning to the BBC, to the breakfast show. And I said on the radio that to die of want in a world of surplus is not only intellectually absurd and economically illiterate, it is morally repulsive. So what we are representing in that which is by definition unrepresentable is so inherent to us, to our very structure, to the sense of self, that art can never arrive at its meaning. And that the pornographication of poverty, this poverty porn that we are dealt with, that journalists rush towards now, as opposed to Michael Burke's elegant report that so riveted a nation at 6 p.m. when it was a monomedia of BBC, where his voice could hardly speak, his shame and his rage was so intense, where he spat the words, where he made you feel what he saw. It couldn't be written. It had to be a man who suspended is journalistic objectivity. The camera, at first objective in the biblical scale, as he called it, becomes the cyclops eye of the self as it focuses in on the subjective individual person who will die as your story moves on. And the effect, of course, to an entire country was to feel that shame and rage. That is journalism. And so when a tiny piece of plastic becomes the focus of that, because there is no other outlet, then you get a sort of economic phenomenon which we were able to utilize. But this thing that I saw and responded to, as did everybody else, and was then forced to endure, I didn't want to go. So Midge and I thought we'd make 100,000 quid, give it to Oxfam, done. That's the most I can do. But the journalist came to me and said, "When are you going to Africa?" And I said, "I'm not." And they said, "Yeah, well, you've got to go." And I said, "I don't have to go." And they said, "Well, you know, Bob, you know." I said, "I didn't have to go to Vietnam to know I was against the war there." And they said, "The reality is, you're the story. If you don't go, there's nothing to cover. We've done the bit about people dying of hunger." And they were right. So I went. And in going, I saw that famine is an economic phenomenon. And that if you want to alter the economics somewhere, you must engage with the agents of change in our world. The agents of change are politicians. So that took 20 years. We got a little bit done at the GH at Glen Eagles. But I can only talk to you of what it is. But you, in this part of the world specifically, but in our country in particular, get it. And you get it and understand it and respond to it because it happened to us. And it just doesn't exist in the memories that provoke the art in Reen Farm or in Curricks. We get it because we must endure it, live with its consequences, and have this folk memory, which some people, I think, find a little doubtful as an argument. But what else explains our endless study of that terrible thing that completely changed us forever?
I think it was a state of New Jersey in the 1990s that passed legislation mandating that the Irish famine be taught in the curriculum of high schools in the United States. That was followed by New York and Connecticut. Quinnipiac University picked up the ball and created the Great Hunger Museum, collected these works of art that have been shown in Skibbereen. So it's in the United States that leadership has been shown in terms of addressing the amnesia that affected almost the entire Irish nation after the famine. Everything that Bob said is absolutely correct. And what you said too is that there will be future famines caused by climate change, caused by drought, caused by a refusal to acknowledge that the way in which people live, consuming so much fossil fuels and so on, will result in the population of Africa, where half the world's children will live in 2050. There will be disaster there. But in 1984, they probably didn't have these. And so children today in Africa can see clean water, they can see toilets. They can see everything that we have here. And it's probably not like in 1984 or in 1847 out by Skull, where people had not travelled outside the parish in their lifetime and had probably no idea of what was possible. So the world is a different world, and the world has changed over the past 20 years, and so action is essential. Thank you very much, Bob, for speaking so eloquently, and for the work you have done. We can pause just for a few seconds, but I would like to ask you to consider some questions in the audience that you might like to ask any of the panelists. It's an overwhelming topic, and the internet may be this, goldfish bowl, but it also enables anybody today to look up what was written in journals in the 1840s on the internet. I looked at it tonight, Fraser's magazine, 1847, the Reverend Townsend and his trip to Skull, and his beautiful description of the countryside, and his reflection on how famine was invisible. He could not see it. He came to Skibbereen in 1847, the Reverend Townsend, and this article was published in this magazine that's equivalent to Vanity Fair today, and the leading magazine in London, the Reverend Townsend. It was the quality of those writers, like Daniel O'Donovan, the Reverend Townsend, and others, who broadcasted to the world. So the issue is one of journalism, reportage, transmission of information, and visual culture, and art. Are there any? There's one question there at the back. Ted Haggerty.
There's a Rowan Gillespie sculpture in the top floor of the exhibition with all the names in it. And there's a little piece beside it which explains that it was influenced by the fact that 650 corpses were found in Staten Island, which had been thrown into the sea, and it became a mass grave, and that those individuals had been exhumed, and their DNA had been gone through, and they were able to actually identify these people. And the question is will there come a time when we look at the graveyard outside here in Skibbereen, there are 6,000 to 8,000 people, and that it will be viewed in some time, and we will mature enough to realize that these people have to be identified in some fashion. What would happen?
Personally, I think it will happen. It's only a matter of time. The list of those who died in the Skibbereen workhouse, their names are recorded. It brings it home to you so vividly. Donovan Driscoll, Mann. They're all the names we know, they're the people we know. So it's inevitable. It will happen. I can't say when. But do any of the panel have?
Link to the record on the left that are there, so you then use to identify who is in the grave. I'm not entirely sure whether you're able to this stage to identify a particular body. You would be able to identify clearly the people in the grave if the records are standard and if the records were found. The one thing that the Gillespie sculpture
because they had they had just
arrived in the States and were shipping records.
so,
That's how Rowan Gillespie
you,
There was a school teacher in Cheshire, in England, and his DNA was matched with that of a Stone Age inhabitant of the Cheshire Gorge. So DNA can be used to track living people and connect them with people going back 40, 50,000 years. It's scientifically absolute. It's simply the case that DNA taken today from people in Skibbereen and the surrounding areas can probably be connected to DNA markers of whatever organic remains are buried in those masses. But it's a colossal job and a heartbreaking one, and in a sense, it probably doesn't teach you anything in a certain way. You know, the knowledge that it can be done and the records that remain are almost eloquent enough in themselves, but it will be done, I think. Oh, what do you think?
I'm not sure it's important. That's what I think. It's fine. I don't think. I'm not sure it's important. I'm not sure it's important for the people who are alive today and they're simply dead and gone. And you know, frankly, if my ancestors had died in the famine, it wouldn't particularly interest me. Yeah, I mean, it's you know, history never ends. It's too busy beginning. And for me personally, I'm much more interested in now and the possibility of the future rather than constantly regurgitating a past and misinterpreting that or using it, as I say, politically. So the past is a very dangerous thing to dig up and empirically prove. I'd sooner let sleeping people lie.
But when you went to medicine, and when you visited the museums like that?
No, I was the same. I mean the same thing. I mean, when I didn't go to Belsen, I went to Dachau and I went to Auschwitz, and it's the same thing. I mean, those of you who've been to some of the Holocaust memorials, especially the what's his name, Daniel Leibowitz, the architect, like in Berlin, they're very frightening. It's very effective, and it's as I explained, it's the ghost of these things. It's the folk memory of what it is and what it was that's much more powerful than finding out that John Murphy died this way. It's your imagination, which is where art and the expression of that is plausible. But my view is you never get to it. And so when I saw Neve's show, it's the cumulative effect of it that leaves you with an impression of utter horror. And then the implausibility of the stories, as you pointed out, like the guy who came here looking for the famine and couldn't find it. It's such an odd story. That wasn't possible in Africa. It was just across the Sahel. It was clear and patent that what was going on, even in the middle of the war. But it doesn't seem to have been the case here. And I have an image, and I discussed this with Mick. I made a program about Yates, and I discussed with Neve and Mick the fact that, forget the Staten Island, the amount of internal displacement, which is a phenomenon of famine, which creates war. I mean, right now, around the base of Mount Kilimanjaro, it hasn't had snow as first time in 11,000 years. And so the people who live around the base haven't had water. So 1 million people are on the move. And of course they need resources, so they go to other people's land. And there's war. Now all wars are resource wars. Even Hitler had to invent Lebensraum as an idea. You know, we need to have living space. Absolute nonsense. And his first grab was for the Romanian oil field sort of thing. So it's all about resources. And as you know, as I say, as you pointed out, climate change, drought, etc., we came to understand Ethiopia as we called it desertification then. The Sahara was moving south. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It heats up the land around itself. The vegetation dies. The desert moves on. And we now know that's just part of the phenomenon of climate change. But these things can be addressed, and they need to be addressed. And so going back and making real that which we know has happened seems to me to be futile. And when I was talking to Mick and Neve, I said, what about the internal displacement here? Because I couldn't read anything about this, and I spoke a lot to Roy Foster. What explains the sudden upsurge in, the Dublin slums, for example, which at the turn of the century were thought to be, in a report, the worst slums in Europe? And I just imagine these armies, of skeletal armies, arriving in Cork and Dublin and Belfast, not speaking the language. And the people of these cities, almost not seeing them. I mean, that must have had stuff about it. Now, I know that James Connolly was going on about it. I know Tom Markowitz and Maud Gonwood toured the country talking about the urban poor. But we don't see that part of it. There's whole areas of this history which clearly we arrive at ourselves today into the concrete present. They're far more interesting to me than picking at the ghost. The empirical past affects us, but those that are gone are gone. And we need to understand what that left us with. And what it left us with was ourselves. And then what do we make of that now? And that's what interests me.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, this is for the panel, and especially for Bob, I'm very he's here tonight. Bob and Pan.
I did come tonight. I'm here.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Bob, would you agree that Black 47, according to some of the history in the Art Centre and the short film, about 15 minutes every day, would you agree, and the panel agree, that 1847 and the time of the famine was deliberately done because it actually showed that Ireland had enormous amounts of resources in grain and crops and everything, apart from the potato, and that the British that they took it off the poor peasants and they exported it back to the UK in order to make money, and with the result that all they had left was the potato crop left. Is that true?
Well, Mick is the historian. My personal view is that it was a bizarre confluence of events. The first thing is that the potato is the singular food that you can actually live a healthy life with. There is no other vegetable that you can use uniquely. And that prior to the famine, the potato type was far more beneficial to people than the one they arrived at, which was cheaper and I can't remember, what was it called? What was it? Yeah, so this was, but the fungus came from Mexico, bizarrely, which they discovered last week. And that's where it seeded itself. And it occurred in a couple of other places in Europe. So that's the first thing. But these people were on subsistence anyway. The phenomenon of grain exports was largely due to the fact that the farmers, the 5 to 15 acre farmers, insisted that they would make the same money as they always had. And they insisted on exporting that wherever they could. Now again, this is not strange to Ireland. Again, in Africa during the famine in Ethiopia, there was a lot of news reports and obviously horror that some cattle and grain were being exported to the Middle East during the famine. Sorry for going off piece and talking about another country, but in the middle of the war there, you had essentially Ethiopia's a federal state, and you had three groups of people, three different types of Marxists scrapping it out. So there was a lot of things that occurred there that occurred here too. So the Mengistu government, who were essentially Stalinists, would move people. It was very handy for them that a famine happened. So they could manipulate that. Now we know for a fact that the arch-villain of all this rebellion, he had, as Mick said, a Malthusian view of population and economics. He thought that there were too many Irish anyway, and this came from God, Deus Ex Machina, this fungus, to solve and resolve the problem, and held back until forced to by, and then the government did what exactly happened in the 80s. They did food for work programs, they gave massive amounts of aid. The Americans gave huge amounts of aid, but Americans are generally very generous. But in this case, what happened was the Ohio Savings Bank collapsed in the Midwest of America. The farmers were being foreclosed. Willie Nelson called me and said he was going to do a thing called Farm Aid, and you know, what did I think and stuff like that to help the farmers. The American government bought all the grain. What would they do with it? If they put it out on the market in America for free, it collapsed the local market. So they shipped it all to Africa, which was extremely generous because they needn't have. But it kept the truckers employed, it kept the shippers employed, it gave money to the farmers. And of course, grain came to Africa, and we could persuade the new president of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, to use the Antonov aircrafts already based in Sudan to ship American grain using Soviet ships out to what was called now Darfur and the refugee camps around there. A similar thing exactly happened in this country. You did have people who think, you know, oh well, they won't say it, but they think that, you know, well, Africans, they're lazy and they're corrupt. That's exactly what happened here. The image of the Irishman as being feckless and, you know, not able to work is complete nonsense. But it's used politically. So no, part of your analysis is correct, but to seek to find obvious villains in complex economic, political and social conditions is worthless and dangerous, and that's precisely where journalism comes into play.
Yeah. And just the second question is, would you agree, Bob, that in relation to Black 47, it's reminiscent of the terrible poor and hungry and starving skulls and skeletons in Sarajevo in the Yugoslav war. Now, remember the Serbs left go hungry behind.
I can't comment on that. All we know is that when hunger occurs, through whatever reason, usually political instability, lack of state structures, poor economy, then the effects on human beings are the same. You can be a northern Ethiopian, you can be someone from the west of Ireland, perhaps you can be in war-torn Sarajevo. It doesn't matter. You die in agony, and you die wholly unnecessarily.
Are there any other questions from other members of the audience?
Yes, if I may. This is directed, I think, primarily at Michael and Bob, but anybody on the panel. I'm thinking about how one deals with it going forward in terms of reporting. I take your point, Bob, very strongly. Famine porn is a serious problem. Atrocity porn is a serious problem in journalism. It's become some kind of performance that takes place on television.
Yes.
And a lot of people make money out of it. And that money doesn't go to the people who should be getting it or support the resources that would help them. I'm a photographer. I've made in my past life a conscious decision not to go to sites like that and photograph because it becomes just grossly exploitative.
Yeah.
I know I can come back, I can show those photographs, I make money and I get to be well known, and it doesn't really benefit the people who are there. So I want to know, from the journalists particularly, but also the artists, how do we, is it possible, in any way, looking forward, looking at new media, looking at new means, to represent this unrepresentable act in some way that is going to make a difference, that is actually going to change things, and how do we do that? Thank you.
I think I'm still sort of slightly idealistic about journalism and what it can do. I don't know it's essential that we have journalism that is able to produce healthy questioners about all the things that we want good journalism to do. The emphasis has been for the last 20, 30 years, 40 years, been on sort of technology and what it can do. I think, on this I'm with Michael Higgins when he talks about ethics. And I think that what we're going to have to look at increasingly is to say the journalism we consume, how ethically is it gathered? How ethically is it put together? And there'll be differences. There'll be those who are producing fake news. There'll be those producing awful, boring stuff. But within it, hopefully, there will be those journalists who adhere to sort of strong ethical standards. And we have to find them. We have to look at where are they out there and say, I can trust these. I'm now sort of recently involved with oddly the newspaper industry. It has a media or news literacy scheme for schools. I'm putting together some of their stuff. It's interesting to have to think about it. You have to say, right, how are journalists taught? How are journalists trained? What are they trained in? Well, too much of it is simply about how the technology works, which is nonsense if you learn that very quickly. What is much more difficult is to learn what's important, what's ethical. And I think increasingly, as I say, we don't have to look and find that. We don't have to go through all that stuff that's out there and say, what can I trust? And we don't have to learn to know what can we trust. We're going to have to learn to examine the information that's out there, to interrogate the information and say, does this person give the sources? What is the reason why I'm receiving this information? And sometimes, when you look at something, it works incredibly. I think of the little boy who his body was washed up on the Greek coast. And I have to say, had I been in a newsroom, I probably wouldn't have been. Right, I probably would have said, don't use that thing. I work in the Irish Times too long, I'm too cautious the way we were taught. I would probably have been wrong, but I think that photograph had an incredible impact. Not for very long, because I think that something like that being published 20, 30 years ago, the impact would have been longer. But we become short-sighted, our concentrations become very short. But it did have an impact. And as I say, I'm probably maybe ridiculously idealistic, but I look and say journalism is still necessary. People are reading an awful lot of it. And I think that the key word to the future of journalism is ethics. And those journalists who are trained to make decisions that they can justify ethically. They can say, it might be wrong, that decision might have been the wrong one, but this is the reason I did it. And it wasn't done to sell more people, not people, to sell to get more clicks or whatever. It was done because I believe it was important. You might be wrong at the end of the day, but that is the motivation. And I think that's what we're going to do there. Rather than just try and find that journalism.
But the impossibility of representation, you know, this despair. I was beginning to despair actually, and think, why bother? Why keep going? Why try and make all this stuff? And then on Channel 4 News the other night, they were talking about elephants, not humans. It wasn't Jon Snow, whoever else was speaking, was saying that energetically, it was actually quite interesting, we must not despair. And I was sitting in Connemara watching this news thinking that it is, yes, what can we do? Certainly artistically it seems very subsidiary and, fluff, really. But I think it's about keeping going at whatever it is you're doing and scratching away like a little rat or whatever, to try and make some nonsense that talks about loss. And I was thinking in terms of the elephant, or all these animals which are becoming extinct, and eventually maybe as humans will become extinct, and then it's only then that we will learn. And I tell a story a lot which refers to art. The Mona Lisa was stolen in 1911 from the Louvre, and nobody noticed for 3 days. And then, when they discovered it was gone, thousands of people queued up to see the empty space. But it's tragic too. It's tragic because it's this perversity that we only know it when it's gone. You know, we only love it when it's gone. And that's part of human nature as well. But the other thing is that little weensy, little Charles thing, do not despair, was terribly, terribly important. Because I think if we all start, and probably everybody, like when you started speaking, Bob, you know, my solar plexus went, you know, it's because it's so hard. And I think we're getting so much of that I think all together we must block those feelings of despair. And whatever it is we do, even if we do nothing, try and block the despair, because I think energetically then something shifts. That sounds spacey, but there's something in that. Otherwise, we'd all just go and jump off a cliff. You know what I mean?
I think you have Something that occurs to me is if you look on the BBC website, there's a little box which says, if you have any photographs of this, send us the photographs, in acknowledgement of the fact that everybody's a journalist now, which of course has enormous dangers as well as the enormous pleasures. We all use our phones all the time. And what has occurred to me in recent weeks is that if you go on YouTube and you look at any of the excerpts from those big series, The Great War or The World of War that were done in the 60s, if you look at the histories of Ireland that were produced on the box, if you look, for instance, at a recent example of Fergal Keane, well, what it gives me is an enormous sense of the importance of journalistic authority. That maybe mixes with Mick's point about the importance of ethics, but it equally is the skill in telling a story with ethics that seems to me to be the important aspect to keep hold of in this period where everybody is potentially a journalist or a reporter.
Those who are, and those who are hopefully coming up and want to be journalists, one thing I would say about everyone wanting to be a journalist, they want to be a journalist up to a point. They don't want to do the boring. They don't want to sit in courts and ensuring that the public have the right to know what's going on. They don't want to sit at local authority meetings, holding accounts as local authorities. So those people who are journalists are actually reasonably safe from all those who might pretend they don't want to do the boring day-to-day stuff. For those of us who are journalists who are trained on that, and that still needs to be done.
Thank you very much. In summary, it's the artists, writers, the journalists, those who can create narratives, visual or verbal or through other means, who manage to put the brakes upon the untrammeled success sometimes of capitalism, which, if left to its own devices, probably would not care, because the Malthusian system still operates in terms of the bottom line. So the ethics element is the most important, the way in which capitalism, which can create those surpluses, which can be distributed, can only be induced to do so by people such as you, who have embarrassed or enlightened.
Well, that's not true.
Not true.
The Nobel economist Amartya Sen, he won his prize for the economics of poverty. It's almost an oxymoron. But his great insight was that famine has never occurred in a democracy. And perforce almost capitalist economic systems are almost the handmaid into democracy. When you have surplus profits, you have choice, and the political aspect of that is choice, is democracy. So famines can occur within any sort of economy whatsoever. In fact, one of the most brutal, of course, is the Stalinist enforced famines in Russia, which George Bernard Shaw decided he'd ignore completely, rather like your man who came to Scotland and see any of the famine victims. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolutionary famines, etc., etc. So it's not. It's a human phenomenon. What prevents it is workable state structures under whatever system and a viable economy that distributes wealth amongst the population. With regard to the last question, I think to put Mick's point about ethics in context, what you have to have is a journalism that contextualizes an event. And for those who want a context and wish to understand the event and not let history roll over you, then that's what needs to be done. But I think to your point that everyone's a journalist now with their phones, what they are is, again to your point, they're taking a snap of a moment and it's completely without context. And that's in fact the world right now. In my case, I saw a famine far away because a journalist stumbled upon these people. And because there was a method of alerting me to this within a 12-hour period, then I responded. It mixed cases about how they had to deal with this over lengthy periods of time, how people could arrive at a news story and then they arrived at this drawing of this woman which encapsulated what the journalist was trying to describe. My response to what I saw Michael Burke reporting on and contextualizing and his human shame at this, my response was to feel that anger and shame, use media to now take that and transliterate Burke's anger to the rest of the world via the radio. But having done that, and the Americans having heard this, they picked up the baton and they did a version. My response to that was to say, let's put the two together with these things that we now know exist called satellites. And so we used a combination of spy satellites, military satellites, television satellites to talk to the world. So when Live Aid happened, it was 95% of available television sets on Earth were showing that concert. So I think that one of the media phenomena of what happened, nothing to do with me, was an early indication that globalization had happened. And within 4 years, of course, Tim Berners-Lee in Switzerland had invented his web. Now, the first part of Tim's genius, who I know, was to call it the World Wide Web. He understood that he was throwing, in theory, a synaptic membrane around the planet, so that when you came onto this thing that he had evolved, this language for talking to each other immediately, when the web trembled. And we have utterly changed. 1989 is the year that our century began. The wall comes down, the Cold War is over, the 20th century, which will be viewed as the 75-year war, 1914 to 89, that ended. And here was the most powerful invention ever in the history of mankind. It's Gutenberg times 6.5 billion. That was available and soon to be in everyone's hand. Politics could be reordered. We're still living with that confusion. That confusion is evident all over the media. We don't really truly know what this economy is. It moves far too fast for us. If there is a new economy, there must be a new politics. But we don't know what that is. We can see our politics falling apart everywhere. The United States, you can see it clearly. Eastern Europe, the new China. It's not fit for purpose. What Darwin, Freud and Marx wrote in the 20th century. Someone's written our century, we just haven't twigged who it is yet. Everything needs to be contextualized. There is a confusion. Everyone trembles on this new hive society that's been built. What does it mean? How do we understand it? We can't, not yet. So what's going to occur from it? And part of this discussion is how do we negotiate this new world that we all feel slightly diffident about? What we do know is that there are human phenomena, the disappearance of other species, which will destroy us. There is climate change. There is terrorism. There is nuclear proliferation. There is the global economy. None of these problems can be discussed or dealt with unilaterally. formal power still resides with the nation state, while at that precise moment, no country could deal with its problems unilaterally. Meanwhile, Britain decides to go Brexit. So, in this world, which you've articulated and which we've discussed about the media, someone needs to contextualize it. You can only do that with known information, and that must be sought for, looked after, and a version of the truth exposed. And then we can begin to understand it. But will people be interested when they want emojis and some bollocks on their phone the next minute? No. So my advice is get one of these and tell the others to fuck off.
One more question from the audience. If anybody has anything that they want to share.
I think, well, they're fantastically extraordinary, compassionate, and intelligent.
I agree with you absolutely, and thank you very much. And with that, I happily thank all of the speakers for eloquent and moving contributions that have made me think. The audience are too, I can see, are really
Fascinated. They can't get enough of it.
I'm going to ask Cyril Holt, who is the chair of the West Cork Arts Centre, to just wind up this very good evening.
Good evening, Mayor Cork and ladies and gentlemen. The chairman of the West Cork Arts Centre, I apologise, thank you again for speaking. To represent the unrepresentable is quite a challenge. Theresa May is probably finding out. Thanks again for providing such a wonderful role to the Coming Home exhibition. This evening signals the closing of the Coming Home and Art and Great Hunger exhibition in Ireland, and the continuation of the Derry North to Derry. It has been a great privilege for us in Ireland to host the exhibition this February, and I would like to express our gratitude and thanks to Ireland's Great Hunger Museum and Trinity University for allowing us to do so. I'd like to thank Ryan Mahoney, the director of Ireland's Great Hunger Museum, and the West President. Ryan Mahoney was here in the audience with the assistant manager, and especially want to thank Claire Rosani, the assistant director and project manager, who provided great support. And a special word of thanks as well to President Eva Sutherland, as the Minister of Visual Culture and Creative of Ireland's Great Hunger Museum. Who was my predecessor, Veteran Tiernan, and our director, Anne Darwin. I'd like to thank them for laying the groundwork as far back as 2050 to bring the exhibition to Skibbereen. Their commitment and dedication to the project was key in ensuring we were building. The artist Anna Kelly staged a performance piece in the grounds of the workhouse in Skull. And I would like to thank Dan Riley, who's in the audience here as well, for his work on this project. Dan was quite obsessive about it, and it became a little bit of a pain in the diary for me for a while, but it was all worked out very well, Dan. Thank you very much. He was ably assisted in that as well by Declan. I would also like to acknowledge the great support of the Board of Ireland in making sure we brought this to Skibbereen. Exhibitions of this size and scope in relation to space and climate control and lighting are usually confined to large city galleries. If you don't live in the city or have the time and funds to travel long distances, you may never have the opportunity to experience art of this nature in all its forms. What has been so uplifting for me is the number of schools and community groups that have visited the exhibition in Ireland. It has been
I would just like to say that we need to work together as a community to maintain and improve and sustain these facilities, which are so key to the rural community. The West Cork Arts Centre is not a not-for-profit organisation. All our existing exhibitions are free admission. And this is only possible by the invaluable support we have received from the Arts Council and Cork County Council. I'd like to acknowledge the local support we received for this exhibition, and it's greatly appreciated. I'd just like to mention again C103, Morgan or Bristol Fine Art Officer of the Valuable, Skibbereen and Landing Credit Union, Fees of Skibbereen, Classical Insurance, the Carthy Insurance Group, and the Skibbereen and District Chamber of Commerce. As we already said, we had 30,000 plus visitors to the exhibition. This is an incredible number. The staff in Millen have worked tirelessly to ensure that it was an enjoyable experience for all our visitors. I would just like to mention some of them here tonight, because I think, when lots of people stand up and get the glory, there's a whole lot of people working very hard to make sure that it all happens, and that it all works very well. Coming home intern Sarah Long, a recent graduate of the Cork, Charlotte Donovan, artist and resident development. Charlotte did Trojan work in coordinating the business of the school and the community. The project house team, Kevin O'Farrell, Sylvia Vickia, Pierre Lambert, Louise McCarthy, and Jackie O'Callaghan. The tour team and invigilators include Sarah Williams and Sarah Rutherford, Mark Beattie, Ben O'Connor, Amy Lee, and Jacek Callian. I would like to especially thank Stephen Canty, our operations manager, who did such a great job here tonight as well in setting all this up. Justine Foster, our program manager, education and community. Louise Forsyth, front of house coordinator. And Sarah Canty, our finance officer. I would also like to thank Anne and acknowledge Anne Darwin, the director of Millen, for her tireless work in ensuring this exhibition ran smoothly, while ensuring that our other work continued and that we are fully prepared for life after coming home. And finally, I would like to especially thank you, the people of Skibbereen and West Cork, for your continued support, and hope to see you all again at future events and exhibitions in Ireland. I have one final task. As I said, we're a not-for-profit, but we bought a wonderful piece of sculpture which we're now going to withdraw to see who's the winner. That piece of sculpture, which I hope you've all got tickets for, Steve was bringing up the jar. We're going to ask Bob Geldof's wife, Sean, to draw the ticket. And we're going to do that now. Just... We know Bob. And the winner of the piece of sculpture is Sarah McCullough in Ballydehouse.